Welcome back. The Bipartisan Policy Center is excited to bring you this panel of chief election officials from Georgia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Election officials were under the microscope this year like never before. They had to combat misinformation on an unprecedented scale, and they did it while being attacked personally and professionally. We are so lucky today to have Yamiche Alcindor, PBS NewsHour's White House correspondent, to moderate this discussion. Thank you, Yamiche.
Thanks so much for that introduction, and thanks so much for having this. I was just tweeting out the link to this because I'm so excited to sit down with these secretaries of state. It's so critical. So I know we're right now, who we have with us is the Georgia Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger. We have Kathy Boockvar, the Pennsylvania Secretary of State, Megan Wolf, who is the Wisconsin Election Commission Director, and joining us in a bit will be the Michigan Secretary of State, Jocelyn Benson. So thank you all for being here. I want to start just by asking a pretty wide open question, but it's the question that's kind of, in some ways, the question to ask today. The Electoral College has voted. Joe Biden is the president-elect. Is there anything left to do on your part? And what is the thing about this election that you wished all Americans could know and would know? And I'll start with you, Secretary Boockvar.
Good morning. Thanks so much for having all of us on. It's a great day for democracy. So let's see. I guess I would start out by saying no. So there's nothing left for us to do. We've certified the presidential, as with regard to the presidential and vice presidential race, we certified that in Pennsylvania on November 24th, sent everything off to the archivist, and that's done. Now we've had the Electoral College meet yesterday. It was a great event, carried out the will of the voters of Pennsylvania. So we're good in Pennsylvania. And to your latter question, I think the most important thing for every Pennsylvanian and frankly every American to know is that the election officials at the local, state, and federal level, the folks that are involved in election security, are the most dedicated professionals that you have ever seen in your life. They take every step of this extremely seriously. So I could say in Pennsylvania, every voter should know that no voter who has not been determined to be a qualified eligible voter has the opportunity to vote. And every qualified voter's vote was counted accurately, counted securely, and the voice of the people was heard. So to me, that's what this is about. Election officials are the champions of our democracy, and we owe them eternal amount of gratitude that everyone should know that they do this day in and day out to make sure that all of us have a voice in our democracy.
Mm-hmm. Secretary Raffensperger, you've said something that is very similar to what we just heard, but you have millions of voters who believe the election was stolen from President Trump. You also had the Texas AG sue Pennsylvania, Michigan, Georgia, and Wisconsin, trying to invalidate their election results. And then, of course, you had 19 Republican attorney generals sign on to that, and 126 House Republicans also signed on to an amicus brief. My question is, where does this leave your party, in particular, the Republican Party? And is it inevitable at this point that the GOP becomes the party that questions the integrity of elections going forward if Republicans don't win elections?
Well, from day one, we've been working on what we called Secure the Vote was our program to give voters confidence. We came out of the 2018 schedule. Stacey Abrams ran, and she had some questions about the election. And so we wanted to make sure that we had a transparent, very engaged process to let people know that their vote would be counted, it'd be counted securely. And that's why we have a new verifiable paper ballot trail. So when we did our audit of the election, we did a 100% retally. And so we could retally all those by hand counting and compare that to the machine tally. And the numbers that made the counties were exactly dead on with not a single vote difference. Mm-hmm. And that shows the accuracy of the machine, but also then gives people the accuracy of the total count. So you have security in that process. We understand that there's been an awful lot of disinformation. I felt like maybe I should go head out to Chuck E. Cheese and work on the whack-a-mole machine to improve my ability to answer all these things, because every day we whack one idea down, it's a rumor whack-a-mole, and then another one pops up. It's just endless, and our staff stays very busy. But there's no truth to anything. Everything that they've said, we have facts on our side and we get those facts out, we want to make sure that voters understand your vote is secure. Every secure vote has been counted. We want to make sure we actually have a Senate runoff coming up. We want to have that confidence in the system.
But I guess the question is still about the Republican Party in particular. Like you said, there's a Senate race coming up. Is it inevitable that if the Republicans don't prevail in those races, that you're going to see a party that's going to be questioning again the integrity of the election? And what does that mean, of course, for you, since you're a Republican? How do you feel your party can go forward with this disinformation that's largely coming from Republicans?
Well, it's sad that people put out information and we just back it up with facts, and we'll continue to do that. That's the challenge that you have with social media nowadays. You can say anything you want out there. We back up everything we do with facts.
Secretary Wolf, I want to turn to you. Election day morphed into election week in 2020. What did you face when you were trying to report results in real time and with appropriate context? And for people who don't understand, why did it take so long for us to understand who won this election? For people who are sitting at home saying, well, something must have gone wrong because we didn't know on election night who won.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me. And, I'm the chief election official for the state of Wisconsin, but I'm not the secretary of state.
Yeah, sorry, should say chief.
Nonpartisan, by law, chief election official for the state of Wisconsin. And, from my perspective, we just have to keep getting out there and talking about the mechanics of elections. I know the media in Wisconsin has heard me say this 1,000 times and is probably sick of me saying this, but from my perspective, it is my job to know the nitty-gritty of elections and to know every detail about how they work. And it's also my job to take that detail and to turn it into approachable information for the public. And, I really think that everyone has an obligation to engage with the facts about elections. But I also think that it's unreasonable for us as election administrators to expect that the public, or even candidates and campaigns for that matter, to understand all the mechanics of how elections work. I get to live, breathe, dream elections administration, but for most people, the elections process is new and mysterious to them every 4 years. So in the months before the election, I had committed to holding media availabilities at least weekly to discuss those mechanics of elections. And I had planned topics for each week where I would give the details of the process that were appropriate for the time frame in the election cycle, and then take questions for as long as it took to explain those mechanics to the media and our partners as they were working with us to explain the details to voters. And we'd also augment these messages each week with social media posts and press releases. And the goal was always to show the process, how it works, not generically tell people about how our elections are great or how they're secure, but to really show them how. Most people are not aware of some of the basics about elections, like that pre and post-election audits of voting equipment are publicly noticed meetings that you can actually attend and observe in each of your communities. Most people don't know that election night results are always unofficial, and that for results to be certified, that they have to be double checked at the municipal, at the county, and then again at the state level through the canvass processes. They're checked again if there's a recount, and then they're checked again through our post-election voting equipment audits. And so really emphasizing to people that there are no dark corners or locked doors in elections. Everything is transparent and part of the publicly observable process. But I think we really need to continue to highlight these opportunities and really welcome the public to engage in that process. And I think we did this as election officials more so this year than ever before, but we continue to need to do more. It's tireless and thankless work, but more people know about the process, the more information that they have about elections, the more ability they have to draw on their own conclusions with firsthand proof about the integrity of our system.
Thank you, Director Wolf, and my apologies for calling you Secretary Wolf. I want to stick with you for a minute because you really just outlined, Director Wolf, what the process is for democracy in this country. But when you hear the president saying, "I was leading at night," and then all people were voting by mail. These voting ballots came in. I lost my lead. What do you make of that? And what should people understand when they hear that? When they hear the president saying he was leading, and then when the votes actually got counted, especially the mail-in votes, that he lost the election?
Yeah, this was certainly a question that we anticipated before Election Day. There's always these questions about why does it take longer for ballots in a jurisdiction like Milwaukee than in smaller communities. And there's a really simple explanation for that, right? There's more ballots. There's more ballots in our largest community in the state, and it should take longer to count those ballots. But I think, again, some of those mechanics of how that works just are not familiar to people. They're not things that they think about being part of elections. And so I think we did a good job of before Election Day saying, this is what you're going to expect. In Milwaukee, in our larger jurisdictions, they have what we call central count absentee, which means that all the absentees are counted in one location. And so you're going to see polling place results coming in from all the various polling places around the state right after the polls close. But those absentees that are all counted in one location, those totals all come in together. So you're going to see results earlier in the night, and then you're going to see the absentees be added later in the evening. And we tried to set those expectations. But I really think that message needs to continue to be amplified, augmented through utilizing the voices of our local election officials. People really trust the voices of their local election officials. I think trust is grown locally. And so I think building off of what we did this year in proactive communication, but let's bring it down to the local level to continue to set those expectations for voters about what they're going to see on election night.
And Secretary Benson, it sounds like you have joined us. You can take yourself off mute because the next question is coming to you. As I sat down to get ready for this, one of the things that was playing in my mind was the fact that you had your home surrounded by people who did not believe the election results, who were accusing you of misinformation. So I want to ask you, what's the scariest thing that happened in the 2020 election? Maybe it's what I just described with people surrounding your home. Maybe it's something else. Tell me about what you experienced.
Well, thanks for having me and for that question. I think all of us have experienced various threats of violence this past year. I mean, for me, it was really my scariest moment overall was when I was 19 years old investigating hate groups undercover in South Carolina all by myself, and was, worried that something would happen. And getting through that moment as a young an investigator and investigative journalist really was a moment that I carried throughout this year, because that is out there, and that if you focus on the work, you can get through it. And throughout this year in Michigan, we've had a number of incidents in which individuals have spouted hateful rhetoric using national platforms to do so, that have manifested itself, as oftentimes hateful rhetoric often does, is an attempt to levy or implement violent threats against public officials, myself included, of course, the governor and many others, frankly, on both sides of the aisle. And so that's been a reality in our state and in many other states throughout 2020 election. One incident, and perhaps a culmination of it, was what occurred outside my home about a week ago. But at that point, I was already in a position to be able to respond with strength and with a focus on the job that we as elected officials have to protect democracy and to protect the voters. And so my reaction that evening was, one, as a mom, protect my son and make sure that nothing affected him. And then secondly, really recognize, as we all have, I think Kathy, Brad, Megan, that we personify an election. We personify the voters. We personify democracy in our role as chief election officers. And in that job, we do have to, in some ways, take what is thrown at us, we'll say that, as a way of guarding and enabling every voter in our state to be able to have their voice heard. And I'll just close by emphasizing, in my team, when we have our meetings, as we have dealt with various different punches throughout the year, what we consistently remind ourselves is we will take a punch so that someone else can vote. And that's the bottom line. And that's what we do sign up for as election officers. And it's something that I'm personally very proud to be able to do, and in service to our country and our democracy.
That's a stark message. We will take a punch so other people can vote. I want to go to you, Secretary Raffensperger. You faced targeted attacks by the president, as did others. What was your experience like, and what were the pressures that you faced? Your scariest moment when you think about this election?
Well, from the standpoint of threats, really, when someone broke into my daughter-in-law's townhouse, that was and then a couple of weeks later, they followed her into a store with their iPhone on, and so anyway, that was scary for her, and that was really troubling for us. Then my wife got sexualized text. We got the death threats, but then they started attacking election workers. One of them was one of our vendors. Persons that were working for them, 25 years old, gets a text. He had a different last name, kind of like I do, and some of us do on this call.
Like
and
Al
so then they
Sandor, I
started,
imagine.
and they started threatening his parents also as well. And so those are the kind of things that happen. Gabriel Sterling, our implementation manager, he really spoke very powerfully, and he spoke powerfully at the right time when that situation arose, and that it needed to end. And we really said it should be condemned. And I don't believe that it's been condemned strongly enough by everyone that we need to have peaceful elections. But I understand that sometimes half the people won't like the results, but we have to have peaceful elections.
As a follow-up to that, thinking about the things that your families had to experience, you said that you voted for President Trump and that he then threw you under the bus. My first question is, how now do you look at your support for President Trump? Do you still see him as someone that you would support? And then two, did you at all see this coming? The president had been saying that the election would be rigged if he hadn't won, and that he had been in some ways spreading disinformation before this election. How do you square your support with knowing what the president was saying?
I'm still a conservative Republican, and that hasn't changed. From the standpoint of the election, a lot of the issues that he had in Georgia specifically, if you look at all of our Republican congressmen that got their number of votes that they had, President Trump got 33,500 less votes. Then if you look in the metro region, Senator David Perdue got 19,000 more votes than President Trump did. And so he really had some challenges in those areas. He did well in many of the rural areas, but he didn't do well in the metro region. And so it's really his whole campaign strategy. And at the end of the day, our job, as Secretary of State, is to make sure we oversee elections, make sure that they're honest and fair. The job of a political party, in this case, the Republican Party, is to raise money and get out the vote. And they got outworked.
Secretary Boockvar, I want to turn to you. How much, if at all, did you face threats or pressure from the White House or people connected to the president, not only to have the election go in his way, but then, of course, to overturn the election? All eyes, of course, were on Pennsylvania, that critical state.
Yeah, I mean, look, as Jocelyn and Brad said, and Megan, I'm guessing you've gone through the same thing. I mean, I think all of us face threats, our families face threats, things that we should never, ever, when I was hearing you ask about the scariest moments for the others, I mean, honestly, when I think about the worst moments, to me, it's the attack on democracy. There has never been such an anti-democratic, unpatriotic, un-American reaction to an election in the history of, I can't speak forever, but, in any of our lifetimes. And that's, I think, what's most devastating. So did I get direct outreach to try to overturn, the results? No, I did not. But has there been I don't need to tell you about what our legislature has been saying and doing, and all the folks who signed on to the Texas lawsuit that of course was thrown out very quickly by the US Supreme Court, not to mention the 58 or 59 other lawsuits that every level of court, I mean, the courts have been doing exactly what they are, prescribed to do, which is uphold the United States Constitution, the Pennsylvania Constitution, and the laws of our country. And they've done it again and again. And I've been incredibly thankful for those jurists who have done exactly what they're supposed to do. They listened to the allegations. They sifted through thousands and thousands of pages of unfounded allegations. And they did justice in the end, and they upheld our democracy. And that's what our nation is about. That's what we've been fighting for in Pennsylvania. And that's what we will continue to do, is fight for the voice of the voters of this nation.
Mm. Um, and with that, with the secretary saying that really the attack on democracy was the scariest thing, I want to turn to you, Director Wolf. Gabriel Sterling's name was already invoked, but that Georgia Republican elections official urged President Trump to rein in his supporters and said someone is going to get killed if this doesn't get stopped. What you're seeing and what other people are experiencing, do you agree with that? Do you think we're going to reach the level that someone might get killed? Just over the weekend where I am in DC, people were stabbed in confrontations between anti-Trump and pro-Trump supporters.
Yeah, thanks for that question. And, I think that unfortunately, some of those issues have been sort of politicized. And I think that's a really unfortunate side effect of all of this. But I think, follow me here for a second, but I think some of the roots of all of this really fall into what I call the gray areas that exist in our election laws and the positions that those gray areas have put us in as election officials. So as a nonpartisan election official, it's my job to implement the law. And I think that's true even of my partisan counterparts around the country. It's our job to implement the law. We believe in democracy. And I don't take a position on laws. I have no interest in the political effect of the law. Whatever I'm handed by our elected lawmakers, it's my job to implement. And not all laws are written to address each of the complexities that may arise in real world situations where decisions have to be made in real time. Procedures in Wisconsin that have been followed for more than a decade were challenged for the first time this year. There are gray areas in the law, and there are gaps that are filled by policy. And I think we need to find a way to identify those gaps and to work in a bipartisan way to create clear statutory expectations. These gray areas, they're not fair to election officials, as they put us in a perpetually untenable position of having to do our best to turn nonpartisan interpretations into practice under hyper-partisan circumstances. And the gray areas, they're also unfair to our voters who simply need clear instruction and expectation that they can follow. So whatever the law is, we will do whatever is humanly possible that's asked of us to implement it and to work with our voters, candidates, observers, to educate them about the process and to make it usable. And, for example, we have a bipartisan commission that passes a legislative agenda. That legislative agenda has gone unaddressed for more than 5 years. And as election administrators, now more than ever, I think we just continue to identify these changes and really illustrate those gaps. And if the gaps continue to go unfilled by legislation or court decisions, we need to consider how we can be even more transparent about the policymaking process and allowing for input. And so I guess my focus on this is really in looking forward and how can we address some of these concerns and try to make sure that the public remains engaged in these conversations.
Following up on that, was asking others about the scariest moment of this election process, but also when I'm hearing you talk about gaps in the law and gray areas, what do you think are the areas that need to be filled the quickest? What are the ones that are most concerning to you?
I think that observers is probably one of the things at the top of my list, right? So observers are a really important part of the process, a really important part of the process. And in Wisconsin, observation on election day is spread across more than 4,000 polling places. The statutes govern that this important aspects are very broad. And they say things like the table for observers can be 3 to 8 feet from registration or poll book, but it otherwise leaves the logistics of how observers are to interact in the polling places, what materials they're able to review, where they're able to be. And that's all at the discretion of the chief inspectors of each of the 4,000 polling places. And so this means that there are 4,000 ways the process can be carried out, and it can result in very different experiences in different polling places. And so I think there's a lot of gray areas that need to be addressed, and we need to recognize that those gaps exist and that we as election administrators have to have tools to deal with them in real time. But I think that observers and making sure that people know where to engage with the process and what the expectations are for that role is a really important place to start.
I want to ask this question broadly because you talking about observers brings me to a question I wanted to ask, which is how did the pandemic impact the ability to have observers take part in the process? And what would you do differently now when it comes to access to voting? There was a lot of talk from President Trump, especially saying that observers were not allowed to see things, that they were too far away. Courts have found that those were unfounded largely and have thrown those cases out. But the question still remains, was the pandemic, did it have some sort of impact on observers? Anyone can answer that, or I can call on someone, but I'm kind of interested in seeing if there was any state that saw specific impacts on that.
The only change we saw this year was an increased interest, more observers than ever before. And the real change, the only impact of the pandemic was they had to wear masks and where possible, keep 6 feet distant. So protect the health and safety of all involved. But indeed, this was one of the more transparent, if not most transparent elections we've had in Michigan. I'm sure my colleagues can say the same. Because we have laws in place to protect that transparency, those laws were followed and more people took advantage of the opportunity to observe the process than ever before. And one other thing I'll add to that, the observation process on election day in Michigan was completely smooth. There was no disruption, and we were very clear, as many of you may recall, going into the process to say that this is voter intimidation and this is observation, and if people cross the line, there will be consequences, but no one crossed the line. There was really no issue, no even calls around transparency until the end of our tabulation process on Wednesday evening following the election, when it began to be announced who had quote unquote won Michigan. And that's when we started to see some of the disruption and also the allegations, false allegations of a lack of transparency. But the actual experience was very smooth and transparent.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Does anybody else want to talk about how the pandemic impacted their state and the ability to vote, if there were any hiccups?
Sure. I mean, the pandemic impacted, of course, on so many levels, the election, including the fact that, we had a brand new law in Pennsylvania, right? In November of 2019 was the first time that we actually allowed all Pennsylvanians to vote by mail. So then we ended up with millions and millions of Pennsylvanians choosing to do that, which also meant more to observe, right? But all of our laws provide for very clear opportunities for both poll watchers on election day, and then every candidate at all can all have observers at the canvas of the mail ballot. So yeah, were there 6 foot distances? Yes, absolutely. And that's for everybody's safety. But I can't believe, Philadelphia and multiple other jurisdictions had a 24/7 live stream. The entire public around the world literally could watch the whole process. And that's a level, like Jocelyn said, there's never been ever anything like this before. This was the most transparent election that we've ever seen in the history of the country, I think, and certainly in Pennsylvania, that's the case.
And calling it the most transparent election in history, I want to go to you, Secretary Raffensperger. You wrote, "The crisis America's elections face is not one of security, but one of confidence." Explain what you meant by that, and especially when you think of the fact that there was so much transparency in this election, but still millions and millions of people believe that the election was not done in a way that had integrity.
Well, there's the first issue that was raised earlier is that many voters don't understand the election process. And so that's really educating voters. And that's why we had to secure the vote. We put a lot of information on our website, social media to get that out there. But also, when we reported the results, there was a question about the accuracy of the machine. So we had to dispel that rumor. Then with the absentee ballot process, as Jocelyn mentioned, that it takes time to do that. So we wanted to have those obviously scanned before Tuesday. So that all we had to do is press the tabulation button. We had additional ballots that had come in. And so that takes a day. And the large preponderance of those absentee ballots were actually ones that went for, Vice President, President-elect Biden. And that's because President Trump did not put out that he did not trust absentee voting. And so as those numbers came in, they did tend to favor more the Democrat Party. It's because the Democrat Party embraced that we are in a COVID environment. A lot more voters are concerned about their health and they're going to vote absentee. And then you had, obviously President Trump telling people to show up in person. And so that's what happened a lot of times is the results after Tuesday tended to start going the other direction. And Gabe Sterling predicted it would be a 10,000 vote delta. It turned out to be closer to 12. But that's really what happened. But then that creates that doubt in voters' mind.
Mhm, mhm. I want to stick with you because my follow-up question is, last night, President-elect Biden said it was unconscionable that the election results were tested, and he said that should never happen again. Do you think we're at the beginning of the erosion of American democracy? Do you think things will get worse from here on out when, again, you have that critical runoff race in your state? Do you think we're now at the place where Americans are always going to be questioning the integrity of an election if it doesn't go their way?
Well, after every election, people have questions. And so we want to make sure we rebuild that confidence. In our case, we want to make sure that we have voter lists that are updated as soon as we can. We join ERIC, the Electronic Registration Information Center, so we can get very objective information when people move from state to state. And then we also want stronger voter identification and absentee ballots. We stood up an online portal which connected us to the Department of Driver Services, which was photo ID. That's a secure way of voting absentee. You know who is requesting that ballot. And that gives not just you, the voter that uses it, but also people that aren't using it, knowing that it is a secure process. So we're looking at ways of really instilling that confidence. And at the end of the day, we want people to understand our job is to make sure we have honest, accurately scored, actually accurately counted elections.
I'm going to stick with you for one more question, which is, how do you do that, though, if people don't fundamentally believe in the idea that the elections are not rigged? You have so many people who just believe these conspiracy theories, and they're being obviously spread by Republican elected officials in a lot of ways. When you think about this, especially as a Republican Secretary of State, is this a conundrum that you're still wrapping your head around, or do you think that there's a solution to this?
I saw this morning on Facebook, a Georgia Republican said, now don't start calling me a Democrat, and he just went through the whole litany of things that I just said. And he said, yes, Vice President Biden is the president-elect, and we just have to accept it, and then we'll come back in 4 years. And so you're seeing that many Republicans are really accepting the reality of the situation, but we're going above and beyond. So for this Senate runoff, we're making sure that we are encouraging both political parties to have monitors there as the envelopes are received, as you're verifying the signature, so that people can verify the process. And also we have 24/7 video surveillance of the entire process. So we want to make sure whatever the transparency level needs to be, let's step it up to the next level so we can give voters that confidence.
Secretary Benson, I want to come to you. You've come face to face with some of the voters who don't believe in the integrity of the election, that are really being edged on in a lot of ways by Republican elected officials. What do you make of this? And do you think that there is a solve for this problem, given that we saw in extraordinary ways Republicans refuse to admit that President Trump had lost the election, and some who continue to do so?
I think there has to be. I mean, the bottom line, and what has really, Kevin, given us strength here in Michigan is the recognition that the truth is on our side. The voters have spoken. Their will has been made clear. The process actually was extremely secure, transparent, and accurate. And it was actually a great success story. I think we can all claim that with such a significant turnout in this election, and it done so during a pandemic. So I think moving forward, which we all want to start doing, let's find a way to heal this deep divide that's been created by this onslaught of misinformation that has flown through social media and other avenues, and it will continue to percolate probably for a while now. Let's find a way to get leaders to move beyond that, identify ways, as Brad was pointing out, that we can continue to improve the system, because you can always modernize, you can always increase the accuracy and security and the accessibility of this system. Let's identify real issues that we can address, make data-driven decisions to solve them, and really start blocking out the noise and misinformation, but also take very seriously the need we all have to embrace to clean up a lot of the mess that has been created through this misinformation campaign, both prior to Election Day and in the month or so that has followed. I am deeply concerned about that, because every citizen should have faith in our democracy. It can be rightly placed in the system this year because everything was so secure and accurate. But when nearly a third of voters, as I've seen, have questions about the security of the process, those questions can be solved and addressed with truth, but only if people are willing to hear it and if leaders are willing to accept it. So I hope it's going to take all of us doing that moving forward, but we've got to do it because we've got more elections in the future. Our democracy is resilient. It is and will remain strong, but we do have some work to do to address the impact of what we've just lived through.
Secretary Benson is talking about healing the country and healing deep divisions. I want to turn to you, Secretary Boockvar, to talk about domestic disinformation. What lessons have we learned from a domestic disinformation campaign? We had so much conversation, I think, about guarding our systems against foreign interference. What do you think you've learned from a domestic interference campaign coming from the White House? And is there a way to heal deep division if our elected officials are going to take part in trying to spread disinformation?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, it's true, the first couple of years of sort of talking about disinformation, there was always this assumption that it would come from abroad. And that's, I think, what's been part of what was so shocking and disheartening about this year is that the people who are doing it domestically are just feeding the interests of our overseas adversaries. They are doing exactly what those adversaries want them to do, which is to continue to undermine our very democracy of our nation. And so I think from my perspective, we've never cared in terms of fighting it. We've never cared what the source was. The key is to keep correcting it. And I think Megan was talking earlier about, the details and the facts. And the truth is, like, we all need to be doing that. We all need to be talking about, I talk a lot about in Pennsylvania, for example, we don't mail ballots as a matter of course to voters. You have to apply for it. And in order to even get a ballot, you need to be checked against your voter record. You're checked against either the Social Security database or your driver's license database. And until they determine that you're actually a qualified voter, you're not even getting a ballot in the mail. That's sort of the front end eligibility and security checking. And then on the back end, when they get your ballot from you, they're again checking to make sure that you were approved, that you requested that ballot, that you were approved, and that you're an eligible voter again. And then you have all the watchers and the people who are making sure that every part of that process is working. But we need to be saying that again and again and again so that the voters we also need to recognize that a lot of this is played on Twitter and Parler now, right? And Facebook. So we have to make sure that Twitter, is taking down accounts that are putting out false information. We have to make sure that we're reporting this again and again and again and continue to put pressure on this. I blame the 24/7 news cycle means we have to be fighting it 24/7, which is a very challenging place to be. But I'm thankful for all of my colleagues here on this meeting because you've all been fighting it every day. And thank you for all the work that you're doing on behalf of the voters.
Director Wolf, I want to come to you. As I sat down and think about this, one of the things I started thinking about was in some ways what you were talking about and what Secretary Boockvar talked about, which is this idea that we're all in some ways learning more about the system overall. In some ways it's a contrarian question, but are there lessons learned from having the President Trump make these false claims? Is a nation learning more by watching electors vote, by watching people, these live streams that were in some ways could have been boring TV, but a lot of people were glued to them because we were seeing firsthand how votes are counted?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there definitely are lessons learned. I'm such a solution-oriented person. Whenever I see a challenge, it's like, how do we solve this? And this is the challenge that we're facing right now. How do we move forward? And I think there's two ways that I've been thinking about and identifying right now in terms of immediate action. One is finding those gaps in statute and figuring out how do we, in a transparent way, address those so that we all have the same expectations as we head into an election and there's no surprises for anyone. How do we communicate those? But I think the second one is how do we support and probably even more importantly, sustain elections at a local level? So unlike most other states, and like our neighbors in Michigan, Wisconsin administers election at the municipal level rather than at the county level. And so what that means is we have 1,850 cities, villages, and towns who administer their elections compared to other states where they might have 50 to 100 counties. And, you know, we may have 2,000 local election officials, but I learned a lot about who they each are this year. And what I learned is that they are resourceful, they are resilient, and they are dedicated public servants who will always find a way to serve their community despite any challenges or any obstacles that are placed in front of them. Many of our local jurisdictions, though, I've also learned, are grossly under-resourced, and there are vast resource disparities across our jurisdictions. So, for example, in Wisconsin, there are 1,200 townships, our smallest jurisdictions, and many of the election officials there are only paid to work maybe 5 to 10 hours a week. Many of them don't have a town office, and they conduct things like absentee voting from their homes. If we want to see consistency in access to elections, we need to not only provide funding to the local election officials, but we have to find a way to sustain it. A township that's given a single infusion of funding is not going to expand access or offerings to their voting community, right? Because those are not things that they'll be able to sustain with one-time funding. They're going to use their one-time funding to make one-time purchases. So I really think that as we're looking forward, if we want to see more consistency, if we want to be able to communicate expectations to our voters, to candidates about what the election process is going to look like, if we want to make sure that our election officials are all adequately trained and that the voter experience is consistent throughout our jurisdictions, we have to invest sustainably in supporting our local election officials.
And the last question in the minute we have left here, Secretary Raffensperger, as you hear Director Wolf talking about all of the different things that we need to do, I want to ask you a question about incentives. Now it seems, at least in part, that Republicans have an incentive to question the integrity of elections because you have millions and millions of voters who showed up in record numbers for President Trump. Of course, he lost the election, but there are still these people that are very much dedicated to President Trump. How do you make sure that people aren't questioning the integrity of the election when they have this huge incentive that maybe will turn out Republican voters if they say, yes, it's true, this was falsely done, this election was stolen, and now you have to back me so I can get it right?
Well, I think that is a risky road for people to play. Stacey Abrams always talked about voter suppression, but if people continue to talk about you can't trust results, you're going to have voter depression. In other words, you're going to depress your turnout. The very people you want to turn out are going to say, why bother if it doesn't mean anything? And so that's why it's not really, if you think about it, you're working against your own self-interest to do that. So it's not logical. At the end of the day, people really need to look at the facts, and that's what we're going to be, very fact-based. I'm an engineer. I want to make sure we get fact bombs out there, information for people to make decisions. But this is the most secure election we've ever had with a verifiable paper ballot trail. We joined ERIC. We've made sure that with the absentee ballot applications, we now have an online portal which connects us to Department of Driver Services. We're just going to continue to press that message. At the end of the day, then people have to say, do you want to win elections or not? You have to get your voters out to vote.
And last question then, what would be your message to President Trump as we are now a day after the Electoral College has voted? What would you say to the president as he continues to say that the election results were false?
Well, I recognize the positional authority that we all have it and we all play. And I believe no one's asked me to give anyone, if people don't ask me for their advice, then I don't offer it. I recognize his positional authority as President of the United States of America. And at the end of the day, he'll have to make his own decisions.
Anyone else with a message for President Trump while we're closing here? No?
I put mine in order this morning so you all can see that.
All right. Well, thank you so much to all of you for joining me, for having this conversation. It was robust. I was so excited to sit down with all of you because you were, of course, in the trenches, were the people who made sure that this election went safely, that it had integrity, that it was safe. And it's important for you who were all directly involved in the election to assure Americans that it was done in a safe and secure way. We're now going to turn to a video from Congresswoman Lofgren, who recorded some remarks for the Bipartisan Policy Center. And thank you, of course, to them for allowing us to have this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You.
Hello, I'm Zoe Lofgren, Chair of the Committee on House Administration, the committee charged with federal election oversight in the House of Representatives. I'd like to thank the Bipartisan Policy Center for inviting me to address you today on the important topic of the 2020 voting experience and our goals for reform. This year, voters and election administrators faced unprecedented challenges in the 2020 primaries and the general election. During a once-in-a-generation pandemic that has killed more than 250,000 Americans, voters faced an onslaught of misinformation, disinformation, shifting voting rules, historic levels of dark money in our politics, voter suppression efforts, concern for the U.S. mail system and would they be able to meet the demand for mail-in ballots, and the fear of contracting COVID-19 at the polling place. Despite all this, voters and election administrators rose to the occasion. More Americans voted in this election than ever before, taking advantage of every avenue available to them to cast their ballots in record numbers. Importantly, the 2020 election was also secure. In fact, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency and others have said that the 2020 election was the most secure in American history. Patriotic election administrators and poll workers across the nation deserve our gratitude for carrying out a safe, secure, and successful election in the face of this crisis. While increased participation in democracy is always our goal, we can't ignore the barriers many voters were forced to overcome in order to cast their ballots. Free and fair elections and unencumbered access to voting are the absolute bedrock of our democracy. Some states undertook measures to increase access to mail-in voting, options like early voting for those who chose to vote in person, and they installed drop boxes for safe, convenient ballot return. For example, my own state of California mailed a ballot to every registered voter and extended the deadline for ballots postmarked by Election Day to be received. But increased access was not equal across the nation. While some states and the District of Columbia mailed ballots to voters, others mailed absentee ballot applications. Some only mailed absentee applications for the primary, but not the general. Worse, some states fought to make it more difficult to safely cast ballots in this pandemic. Almost across the board, and despite the best efforts of well-intentioned election administrators, voters were faced with a confusing patchwork of voting and ballot return procedures. Now, as we learn the lessons of the 2020 election and examine possible nationwide improvements, we must do so with this express goal. Let's ensure increased equitable access to the ballot for every American. The American people deserve a democracy that works for everyone, regardless of race, party, or zip code. This work begins in the 117th Congress by passing H.R. 1, the For the People Act. H.R. 1 contains critical pro-democracy reforms such as automatic voter registration, online and same-day registration. It ensures that individuals who've completed felony sentences have their full voting rights restored. It expands voting by mail, early voting, and it modernizes the U.S. voting system. H.R. 1 also prevents unfair voter purges. It protects against discriminatory voter ID laws and ends partisan gerrymandering. Importantly, this bill includes clear nationwide standards so every voter knows how, when, and where to vote with the confidence that their ballot will be counted as cast. H.R. 1 also makes long overdue investments to protect the integrity of our elections against foreign interference and ensures confidence in election results by supporting the adoption of paper ballots, risk-limiting audits, and by enhancing security requirements to protect our election infrastructure from cyber attacks. The For the People Act also ends the dominance of big money in our politics, and it strengthens ethics in government. It is the most transformational package of pro-democracy reforms in many decades. The House stands ready to act, and I look forward to working with my colleagues to pass this bill and other important measures to strengthen our democracy. Thank you again for inviting me to participate in this important forum, and thanks for your contribution in the cause of a successful, safe 2020 election.
Thank you, Chair Lofgren, for sending along those remarks. We appreciate the House Administration Committee's focus on election policy.